So this is the third presentation in the Biochemistry Abridged series. So last time I talked about what is biology, so the bio component of biochemistry, and now I'm going to talk about the second component, which is of course chemistry. Now we'll note that this is a very condensed set of information about chemistry, so what's probably going to happen is there's going to be a number of terms which actually probably will make you come up with more questions than you might have coming into this. But this is just a very, very fundamental grounding about the basics of chemistry. And I'll look at possibly where I can expand on certain components in future videos. So just to read the Wikipedia definition of chemistry, chemistry is the scientific discipline involved with elements and compounds composed of atoms, molecules, and ions, looking at their composition, structure, properties, and the changes they undergo during a reaction with other substances. Now, I've included this picture on the right just because this is probably what the average person's idea of, if someone said chemistry or to try and depict an image of chemistry and chemical reactions, you'll probably see something like this, which is a series of interestingly shaped glassware, I should say, interestingly shaped glassware, probably with food dye in it. Looks pretty, but it's a bit bullshit, so I wanted to get that bullshit element out of the way. So let's break down some of these terms. So the atom is the smallest unit of matter, and atoms are what comprise a chemical element, which I'll talk about a bit later. Now on the right is probably what people would think of if they think of the atom, who's similar to like the Jimmy Neutron logo. But whilst this was a standing model for quite a lot of the history of atomic science, I'll show you that this isn't quite representative either, but you can get the main components of the proton, neutron, electron, and the nucleus from this diagram. So a molecule is a group of two more different atoms, and when we talk about charge, we talk about the electric charge. So in a molecule, across all of the particles in the molecule, the summation of all the different charges is neutral. So whereas an ion is an atom or molecule where the summation of all these charges produces a net positive or negative charge. So I mentioned I'd go over some of the atomic terms. Now, the proton and the neutron are the particles which make up the nucleus, which sits at the centre of the atom. And the proton has a +1 electric charge and has an atomic mass of 1. And these are sort of relative units of mass. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what these actually represent in grams or kilograms. But if you see like atomic mass, generally you'll see these units kind of in relation to each other. So both the proton and the neutron each have a mass of 1. And generally the mass of an atom, if you will, is almost entirely comprised of the mass of the nucleus. Whereas the electrons, which will spin around the area around the atomic nucleus, they have a -1 charge, and they are, I'll say, almost massless. It's something ridiculous like 1 over 18,000 of an atomic mass. Now, this is a more accurate depiction of an atom, so rather than having this quite chunky nucleus with some electrons spinning in distinct ellipses around the nucleus, what's the case is more like the nucleus is this tiny P, and the field of which the electrons could be in, can be moving around in, or present at any point, is kind of like taking the P analogy. It's like the nucleus is a P, and the field of electrons is a football pitch. So actually, the old image, whilst convenient, doesn't really get the scale or the kind of the vast relative area that electrons can be moving around in. So just on this image, the black area is the electron field, and the nucleus is this tiny red and purple dot in the middle, with, I believe, the protons in red and the neutrons in blue. So I'm going to hop back to the basic chemistry terms. Now, an element is a pure substance containing only atoms with the same number of protons in the nucleus. So I'll touch on the periodic table later, and this will come back into play. But an element is defined by the number of protons, because neutrons, whilst they change the mass of the atom, and I can touch on this in a future video, it's the protons which will differentiate the different properties of these elements. So an example of an element would be hydrogen, another example would be oxygen. Now, they will exist in their standard state, so these would exist as gases. But these gases are all entirely made up of just hydrogen atoms or oxygen atoms. Where you get a mix is something called a compound. It's a similar sort of idea that every particle within the compound is identical, but these are molecules. So the example I've given here is water, where every molecule of water is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom covalently bound into a molecule. I've got to go over chemical bonds in a future video because this is, as I say, a very, very basic intro to chemistry. This is something else you may have come across in some depiction in a variety of complexities, but the periodic table of elements is a way of organising all of the chemical elements that make up everything in the universe. Now, when I say make up everything in the universe, this is everything that is made up of identical atoms. You can split things down into more and more fundamental particles. So, for example, you can split the proton and the neutron up, and you can take electrons off atoms and put them onto other atoms, which is where we get ions from. But these are the chemical elements which make up everything in the universe. So starting at the lightest being hydrogen, and the heaviest being this OG symbol, which I couldn't tell you all the element symbols off the top of my head, not least of all because a lot of them are derived from Latin roots. So iron is actually Fe from the Latin ferrium. And similar with copper, it's actually Cu from cuprium, which is the Latin for copper. Now you'll see that there is a top number here, and this denotes the number of protons. So it's the same as its atomic number, and that property is denoting all the different elements. So hydrogen has 1 proton, which makes it distinct from helium, which has 2 protons in its nucleus. I'll talk about the atomic mass in a future video, and I'll just note that with the helium atom, it looked like there was a 1-to-1 ratio of protons and neutrons, but this isn't always the case. You sometimes get a couple more neutrons than the number of protons. Although in terms of biochemistry, you're probably not going to come across many examples. And later on, I will talk about the elements which are more important and abundant across life. And you'll find that is actually a relatively small fraction of all the elements you see in front of you. Last time I talked about the scale of biology, and I wanted to do the same thing for the scale of chemistry to sort of talk about the sizes that the field of science covers. I'm going to use the standard order or standard form again. We've got a small number times 10 to the power of something else. So looking at the maximum kind of field of size of study in chemistry is in the hundreds of micrometers. So very nearly in the millimeter range. So the example I've given is the size of a grain of table salt, which is 5 times 10 to the minus 4 meters, or it's about 500 micrometers, or 0.5 millimeters. That's probably a bit more of a realistic term in terms of the everyday. And the smallest, looking at femtometers, is the length of a proton, which is a femtometer. So this is, imagine 1,000,000,000,000,000th of a meter, which is kind of, you can't really get your head around. Or at least, even if you understand the units of measure, it sometimes seems quite abstract, these tiny sizes. And this picture below is of a proton. And as I said, you can split the proton up, and these are the up and down quarks that make up a proton. But that is going into the realm of physics and the standard model, which I'm not really going to touch on in Biochemistry Abridged because it's not so relevant. This is very much for the world of splitting atoms and the stuff that makes up stuff. But in terms of biochemistry, hopefully you'll have now got a better idea of where we're looking at in terms of the scope of the size. And a very short answer to that would be we're looking in the realm of molecules. And there will be, as you'll see later on, there will be elements of electron exchange, proton exchange, and there'll be sort of even small molecules that sort of change states and have different atoms added to them in terms of chemical reactions. But just keep the term molecules in mind, or biomolecules, as we move forward in this presentation series.